going to be dividing up our course according to the College Board's units. They have the history of the United States broken down into 9 different time periods. And so our units for this year are going to correspond to those 9 time periods. We will begin today with Unit 1, which is time period 1 from the College Board, which begins with pre-colonization. You know, we think about the United States with the English colonies being established, but we need to know what was in North America first, who was vying for power and who was working to try to control the different areas of land. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And this is really an expanded version of the lecture. So you can definitely use this, pause this, watch parts of it as a review to help you to understand the reading that you're responsible for. So I'm going to go ahead and put all of chapter 1 together in this one single video, but certainly break this up into chunks that are more manageable for you and come back and forth. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and I want to go ahead and get started. Okay, whoops. Okay, so here we are. You can see that I've got the first unit there, and notice the dates for this time period. We've got 1491 to 1607. And there's a reason why they have chosen these dates. We would maybe think of these as like anchor dates, dates that would be significant in some ways. The reason that they chose 1491 is because that is the year prior to Christopher Columbus arriving in the Western Hemisphere. We want to know, what were the indigenous people like? How were they living? What groups had they already formed? What types of civilization did they have, and how did it compare with that of Europe at the same time? Then the end date for Unit 1 is 1607. And the reason they've chosen 1607 is that is the date that Jamestown was founded, the first permanent English settlement in North America. So this is going to span the other settlements. The Spanish were in North America first. The French are going to come in at about the same time as the English, but we're going to go ahead and establish these Spanish colonies. We're going to start looking at the transatlantic world. You could think about the Atlantic Ocean and all of the different regions that surround the Atlantic Ocean as being interconnected once we get into the more sophisticated types of technology that allow for shipping. Let's go ahead and get started. So we definitely are going to be considering that these worlds are indeed colliding. We've got a very well-established indigenous group of people living in North America that will definitely be impacted by the European settlement that arrives here. Europe also will be impacted by the settlements that are created in North America, and certainly Africa will be impacted as well. So all of these worlds are going to be colliding at one time. If we look at this Native American experience, what I've shown here, this image is a very famous image of the Secatan village, which is in what today would be the coastal area of North Carolina. At the time, the English would have called this Virginia, because there was basically everything that the English had in North America would have been considered Virginia at that time, but then other colonies, English colonies as we know them, will form from what was originally this big expansive land of Virginia. So Secatan Village is a native population of Algonquin Indians, and we'll talk about what that means in a few minutes, that lived in this area, and it was pretty well settled. This man, John White, who was an artist and a map maker, had been one of the settlers who came. He was actually the governor of the settlement for a period of time in this colony that was called Roanoke. Now, this is all before Jamestown, so this would have been in the 1570s and in the 1580s. And John White, because of his talent for artwork, notice that he is going to give the people of England a very, very strong indication of what life was like back in North America. So if we look closely, we've got some buildings that are here along a regular type of thoroughfare. If we were to examine these a little bit more closely, some of the buildings would have been used as burial grounds for certain peoples. You would have had housing. You've also got groups of natives that are participating in some sort of a ceremony down in this area. We've got a fire that's being set here. We have some people who are working with harvesting crops and seeds and that kind of thing. But I want you to notice closely the way that he's showing the crops here. We've got crops, which this turns out to be maize or corn, and you see it growing in various stages. This looks like a little bit more mature crop, and then you've got the seedlings that would be over here, and you've also got other plants. These are going to be pumpkins that are also going to be growing in the fields. So this gives us a good understanding that this native group understands crop rotation, that it's important for you to plant your crops and have them at various stages to replenish the soil. They had a variety of crops that they were growing at the same time. So as we look through these various native groups, I want you to think about the idea of sophistication and the idea of civilization. So just in this one image, we're able to see cultural identity through rituals. We're able to see agricultural expertise. We're able to see housing that is made from elements and resources in the environment. So this is already looking like an area that is not a group of savages who are roaming in the woods and the wilderness and don't have any sort of culture about them. This is a very well settled community. All right, some of the other images in these watercolor paintings that John White created, there was a very large series of paintings that were created. Look at some of the others. All right, so this is going to be one of the chiefs who was the leader in the community. You can see he's got the longbow. He's wearing some sort of jewelry. He's got body paint. He's got a feather in his hair. So again, this is showing that he is adorned with some sort of idea of what's valuable in the community. But I want you to notice the way that he is depicted here. He's smiling. Yes, he's holding a long bow, a weapon, but he's smiling and he's got his hand on his hip. He doesn't look like he's standing in some sort of an aggressive posture. Think about why John White may have depicted him in this way. We also mentioned that John White was a map maker, and this is his map of the coastal area of what at that time was Virginia, but today we would know it as North Carolina. And you can see that he's trying to map these various inlet areas and the rivers that are going through here and what areas that the English are going to be settling. Now, John White, the community ends up having a devastating outcome. As he was governor of the area in 1585, he actually leaves the Roanoke settlement in 1587 to go back to England to get more supplies. Well, when he's headed back over, this was during the period of time where Queen Elizabeth I is fighting with King Philip of Spain, and you've got the Spanish Armada, and you've got all of this fighting that's going on in Europe, and he gets delayed and doesn't end up making it back to the colony, the Roanoke colony that he had established before he left. He didn't arrive back until 1590. So he's been gone for a good 3 years. And he had left his daughter behind, and his daughter had a child. The baby's name was Virginia Dare. They named her Virginia after the name of the colony. And so all of these people were gone. When he arrives back, the colonies disappeared. And that's one of the big mysteries, the lost colony of Roanoke. What happened to it? Did the natives attack, or did they succumb to some sort of a massive storm or hurricane that blew up along this coastal area, which is prone to happen? You know, just what happened to it. But this is, again, one of those early colonies. It didn't last. Notice the timing here, 1585. It won't be until 1607 that English plants its first permanent colony at Jamestown. So here's another depiction of the Secatan village, and you can again see these structures. He gives us a glimpse on the inside, and they're pretty elaborate. If you look at the scale here with the people and the size, these are known as longhouses or wigwams, where you've got the thatch that's going to be on the outside. Again, they're going to be permanent dwellings. So these are not nomadic people who are roaming around. You've got the palisade around the side that's providing protection and only one entrance. And this is, again, for security reasons. These are some of the warriors, and you can again see how he is depicting the people. They look very strong, very fit, and he is showing them with these long bows. Here is one of the wives of the chief, and you can see how she's depicted. She's got tattooing, she's got beads around her face, and some jewelry. So again, the way these people are depicted, they don't come off as aggressive. So why might John White have shown them in this way? Could he be trying to promote this idea of peaceful natives, that it's safe to come to North America, to the colonies? It's highly possible that that's what was going on here. All right, so these first Americans, you know, we've skipped ahead a little bit by talking about John White, who would have settled over here or tried to settle in the Roanoke region. But the first Americans would have initially settled here in the West. We've got to go back thousands of years ago, between 13,000 and 3,000 BCE, with the land bridge. So during the Ice Age, you had the land bridge that people crossed there across the Bering Sea. And then eventually, when the Ice Age ends, that Bering Sea, the land bridge goes away, the people become isolated. So there's really three different waves where we see migration into North America from this area of Siberia. One is through the land bridge. One, you're going to see boats that are going to be following this ice sheet as well, that bring people along this coastline. And then also you're going to have people who are going to be migrating across the Aleut and the Inuit peoples who are going to settle here in what we know as Alaska. So as they're settling here, then eventually there's going to be migration farther to the south. Obviously, you're going to have more temperate climates, and then areas that are going to be more suitable for farming and agriculture. So the movement of people is actually to the south and from the west to the east. And I think one of the problems that we have as you know, in modern society, and we think about American history, and we will get to next semester this idea, or actually later this semester, this idea of manifest destiny, that the movement of Americans to the West, and the West as being this unknown frontier. Well, if you think about it, the migration was actually from the West to the East. So we've got to kind of look at this big picture here of the indigenous groups that lived in this particular area. The geography and the climate will determine how the various native groups will be living. And you can see that we've got agriculture, very settled agricultural areas in what becomes the first 13 colonies. Some of the other larger areas that we will talk about, the Aztec civilization, very well settled, and then into the Andes Mountains of South America as well. You're going to see more agriculture that will happen here. Obviously, along this coastline in the area that's farther to the north, that you don't have a very temperate climate, there's going to be more fishing that will go on. And then you've also got here in the Great Plains where you don't have as much rainfall as you do in the eastern woodlands. That's going to be more of the hunting and the gathering. But there was still some agriculture that was going on, but not on as large of a scale. We need to realize that there have been some changes as to what we know about these various groups. So why has it changed? Why are we seeing more changes to our understanding of history? And all of that has to do with new developments in the fields of archaeology and anthropology. So the narrative has changed. So a lot of people think, well, history never changes. Actually, it does. As we gain better understanding and we begin to piece together artifacts from archaeology, understanding of different ethnic groups, we have a more complete picture of history, and we do need to go back and make some of those changes. This is a document that I've used in the past with my classes, and I usually introduce this on the first day of school. And it's an essay that was written by a very famous historian. His name is Charles Mann. And Charles Mann wrote this essay, and it was entitled 1491, where he's trying to establish what groups of people lived in North America prior to European contact. And he traces the story of how that's changed over time. And he is going to highlight various historians. He talks about that in 1910, the famous ethnographer at that time, James Mooney, indicated that he believed there were about 1.1 million natives living in North America at the time that the Europeans arrived. Well, by 1966, so maybe 50 years later, that estimate had changed dramatically. And then the historian Henry Dobbins in 1966 said, nope, it was more like 112 million people. So there's already a huge discrepancy in the numbers of people that historians believe lived in these particular areas. So why might there be differences in the numbers? And that's what Charles Mann starts to talk about here, is about why the so-called high counters, why would later on there be this revision in the numbers? And why might some people want to keep that number low? And he hypothesizes and goes back to this idea that if you're telling the story from the European perspective, it's easier to justify claiming this land and territory if it's not already occupied by somebody else. So if you've got, this idea of these vast, wide open areas over an entire continent or two, and you believe that there's only about 1 million people spread out over that entire continent, then you're not really forcing your will on very many other people. And so maybe there's a reason why some of these numbers are skewed the way that they are, and that's why we have to constantly go back and examine history and look at our sources of evidence. So some of the largest civilizations that were established, obviously the Aztec civilization, beautiful, very well-developed community, the capital city of the Aztec civilization in near what we would call today Mexico City, Tenochtitlan. You're going to have the aqueducts, as you can see here. They had, just enormous amounts of gold and opulence. You've got the calendar here that they used. And this was very quickly lost to Spanish conquistadors once they arrived in the 1500s. So this Aztec civilization, the chief there, Montezuma, he was eventually overtaken by the conquistadors. Hernan Cortez is going to come in and take over that society. So I know that those are topics that you studied a good bit last year in world history. The Incan civilization is going to be farther south in Peru and runs across the Andes Mountains. By the way, population-wise, if you go back to Tenochtitlan, there was an estimate that in that particular capital city of the Aztecs, that the city had a population, they estimate, of 250,000 people in 1500. That would have been before Spanish arrival. And at the same time, the largest cities in Europe, London and Sevilla in Spain, would have only had about 50,000 people. So if you've got a population in the hundreds of thousands, you've got to have a way to feed all of those people. You've got to have conditions conducive to sanitation. All of that's got to be worked out. Specialization of trades, all of that that makes a civilization had to be in place for that large of a civilization to exist. So this is a picture of Cusco, or this is outside of Cusco, which was the capital of the Incan Empire at the time. And this is at Machu Picchu. So this is also part of the Incan civilization. And this is my niece right here. So she and her husband, Harrison, and his whole family spent one of their winter breaks at Machu Picchu. So there's the grandfather and the aunts and the uncles and the brothers and the sisters and the parents, and everybody all went and hiked the Incan Trail and went to Machu Picchu. All right, the key to this idea of civilization is, again, being able to feed that large of a population. And the Mesoamericans, so this idea of the Aztecs and the Incas, that whole area in Mexico South, had become very successful at growing maize or corn. And the economy is going to be based on this cultivation. So if you're able to specialize and set aside large areas of land for the cultivation of this particular crop, then you can allow other people within your society to have different jobs. They can specialize in those particular occupations that, again, you're going to have artisans that maybe build buildings or are able to, they're artists. So all of that is possible because you can feed your population. So the economy becomes centered on specialization of labor, and that's because you have a well-supplied food source. And then all of that creates what we would consider a civilization, where you've got larger populations that are specialized. You have technological advancements, you have a government structure, you have a social structure, all of that's in place. One other thing that I want to mention about maize cultivation, the maize cultivation spreads from Mexico to the north. We're going to see people in the desert southwest of what we consider today the United States that start to grow corn. Then it begins to move farther to the east. And then eventually we will see with Columbian Exchange, it makes its way to Europe. And so this corn and the potatoes that are grown in the Andes are also going to be very, very essential. Sometimes you hear referred with the growing of various crops by these indigenous people. It's called the Three Sisters because they're grown together. Maize, and I want you to write this down, the Three Sisters would be maize, squash, and beans. And they would group it together. All right, so if this is a corn stalk, you would plant the maize first, and you would put various seeds for the maize in one cluster. And then once the plant got, it began to grow maybe a few inches out of the ground, the seeds had begun to produce the stalk. That's when you would plant the beans and the corn, because the beans have a stalk. They've got a vine that they've got to cling to something. So the corn stalk becomes what the beans are going to be able to cling to. And then the squash has like a ground cover, and that's going to prevent any sort of weeds from growing and choking out the beans and the corn. So the Three Sisters, they all work together and they're planted in these clusters. So think about the diet. You've got corn, you have squash, and you have beans. And all of that together with the meat that's being hunted provides a pretty well-balanced diet for these indigenous people. Okay, The way that they're going to govern themselves or divide themselves, we're going to move now out of the Aztec civilization and the Inca civilization and move farther to the north in what eventually will become the United States. And these are the various groups that would live in these particular areas. They're going to live in what are known as chiefdoms or confederacies. So sometimes you see one paramount chief, one person who is all powerful, and then maybe they take over various other groups and they have local chiefs, but they're all going to be reporting back to this one primary chief. One of the things that they do within these chiefdoms is they rely a lot on generosity, that to be a chief, you've got to have this idea of benevolence or taking care of your people that gives you the legitimacy for to earn the power from them, really. And so they often will give back. So they're going to give back to the people. And then sometimes we'll see confederacies that will form where various tribes or groups will band together for a common cause, but then maintain their own identity. So I want to talk first about the Mississippi River Valley natives. So they would live in this area. There's a large area, and they rely very heavily on the Mississippi River. So they are going to be fishermen. They're also going to have a very elaborate trade network that will allow them to move goods and products across different areas. So one of the main civilizations that you need to associate with the Mississippi River Valley group would be that of Cahokia. And Cahokia is enormous. You're going to have over 150 of these mound structures. These were the mound builders. So the mound builders, they would create these civilizations, and then everything is going to support this main community. And there were thousands and thousands of people who lived in Cahokia and in the surrounding area. The paramount chief would live here on the top of this largest mound, and then you're going to have kind of a marketplace that goes around here, and then people, whether they've got crafts or whether they've got food that they've grown, they would bring it into Cahokia, and it's almost like this market exchange that's taking place with these mound builders. But then something happened, and all of a sudden, the thriving city of Cahokia, and this is close to St. Louis. St. Louis, Missouri is right over here. It's kind of near where St. Louis would be today. But something happened, and the civilization was wiped out or declined. It may have been a drought. It may have been some sort of disease. We're not sure. But for whatever reason, the people who were surviving here in Cahokia, they dispersed and they spread out. And some of those mound builders from this region along the Mississippi River ended up migrating into our area of what today is Georgia. And that becomes the Etowah Indian Mounds. So if you've ever been to the Etowah Indian Mounds, it's just north of Marietta in Bartow County, maybe 45 minutes, maybe up I-75. And it's not nearly as large as Cahokia, but it's the same type of structures. You have these massive mounds, and I can't even give you an idea of the scale. You know, a person might be this size here. Let me back this up. There we go. So these mounds were known for being ceremonial places, this tallest mound, and then the Etowah River goes along this site. If you go and visit the site today, they've got a number of artifacts in the museum, and they will also tie together this story of the Mississippi River Valley natives with those that live near the Etowah Mounds. And what's interesting to me about this site, they've really only excavated about 10% of the land that's there. So we really have not uncovered all that there is to know about the Etowah Mounds today. Another group that we want to look at would be the Eastern Woodland natives. And so this would be along the East Coast, and they're going to rely on more farming techniques. They're going to have pretty solid climate here. Mississippi River Valley would also be good farmers because they have good soil along the riverbanks. but also they were more fishermen. So where the Eastern Woodlands are going to be hunters and they're going to be farmers, they're sedentary, they're not, you know, nomadic or roaming around. They're going to live in these structures like we talked about, the wigwams and the longhouses that are made of the thatch and the wood from the forest. The Eastern Woodland groups are going to, in their homes, they're going to be a matrilineal society. Most of these tribal groups are going to be matrilineal, meaning that the family is going to be traced through the mother's side of the family. So you would have an entire extended family that would live in this one house, this one structure. So you would have the mom and the dad, the children, the grandparents, they would all be living in this one structure. And let's say that there was a marriage, then the man who married the daughter would come and live in his wife's family's home rather than the wife going to live in her husband's home, because again, it's a matrilineal society. This is what the structure would look on the inside. You can see that they've got these pretty elaborate poles. They would use the fires on the inside. They had holes in the roof like a chimney that would draw the air, draw the smoke out. And they had sleeping structures, and they would dry food. All of this would be done within these pretty elaborate structures. There were tribes that were unique to the Great Lakes region, and they're going to have more of these clans. So there's a lot of different tribes, but there were clans within the different tribes. And if you were of like the Bear clan or the Elk clan of one tribe, you would have a similar type of connection to the Bear clan of another tribe. So again, it gets very complex, these social structures and these trade groups among these Great Lake tribes. Again, they were fantastic fishermen. They had very stable, sturdy boats that they would use to travel up and down these lakes that are of great, great size. And so they did interact with a lot of different groups, even down into Cahokia and in some of the Mississippi River Valley tribes, because it's all interconnected by that Great Lakes region. One group that's going to be a little bit different will be the Great Plains or the Rocky Mountain tribes. And notice that these are depicted on horseback. These would be the ones that we think about in the, you know, the Western movies where we see the cowboys and the Indians and they're all fighting and they're hunting the buffalo on the horses. Well, this is a European animal that has been brought to North America. The natives on the Great Plains were some of the earliest adopters of domesticating the horse and using it to their advantage as they hunted bison. So in these areas of the Great Plains, it's going to be it's a semi-arid region where you have limited rainfall. So you don't have large forested areas like you would have in the Eastern Woodlands. You're going to have more open areas, and that's going to be more conducive to the hunting that they would perform. So these natives are going to be using the horses through the Great Plains to hunt the buffalo and the bison. So when we think about nomadic tribes, there are certain times of the year where the men of the tribes would go out and they would hunt and follow the bison herd. They would take with them the teepees. You've obviously seen the teepee structures. That was more of a mobile home where the poles would be dragged behind the horse, and they would have animal hides that had been put together to form the canopy that goes around the teepee structure. So all of that is being used as they're hunting the buffalo, and they use every part of that buffalo. They're going to use the hide for the clothing, the meat obviously to sustain the full tribe. All of that's going to be used by them. The bones are going to be used for making tools, fashioning tools. But again, you're seeing these men who are following those herds during certain times of the year, but then you also have the rest of the tribe, the older members of the tribe, and then the women and the children would be back waiting on those buffalo hunters to come and return. Sometimes we see that these tribes were also using their ability to hunt and use this horse to their advantage to take over areas, hunting grounds of other tribes, And we end up with these raiding groups where there were more conflicts between these groups than we saw in some of the others because of this competition for land. So I mentioned that the men here were responsible for the hunting and then potentially getting into the warfare. That's going to be pretty uniform across most of these tribes. The women are going to be responsible for the farming and all of the responsibilities that take place within the community. So that's going to be, again, kind of this division between the men and the women, both being responsible for sustaining the society, but in different ways. The Great Basin, this is going to be kind of this area between the Rocky Mountains that would be over here and the Sierra Nevada Mountains, which would be along this border between California and Nevada. So it kind of forms this basin between these very large mountain ranges. And these groups of natives were somewhat isolated. So they didn't really see much interaction between the Great Basin tribes and those of the Great Plains because the Rocky Mountains would block their interaction with one another. Same thing with these tribes with those that would be along the Pacific coast because of the Sierra Nevada mountains. So this is going to be kind of a more isolated area. So they're hunters, but they're not going to be as successful because, again, they're not going to be there's not going to be as large of a variety available to them. In the desert Southwest, you would think that this would be an area that would be really difficult for agriculture to thrive, but these were sophisticated groups of people who began to use ideas of technology and irrigation to solve a problem. So geographically, they have a problem with very, very little rainfall, less than we would have seen in the Mississippi River Valley or the Great Plains. And they're also not going to have soil that's going to be as conducive for some of the other crops. So they have to be very, very strategic in the way that they set up the flooding during certain times for their crops. And these groups would be in the desert Southwest. Most of the time you're going to hear them referred to collectively as a group known as the Pueblo Indians. That's going to be meaning, Pueblo meaning community. So these communities of natives, the Anasazi and the Hohokam, you definitely need to associate the irrigation that they're going to be using. Notice also their housing. So we looked at the wigwams and the longhouses in the eastern woodlands, the mounds of the Mississippi River Valley. But here in the desert Southwest, you're going to see these cliff dwellers. It is an enormously desolate region, so you don't really have a lot of timber to be able to build a timber frame house. But it's also really, really hot there. So by using the overhang of these cliffs, you can build in with adobe. So that's like the dried clay, making those bricks. You can build these adobe structures. And this is at Chaco Canyon, which is in what today is in New Mexico. And you can see these people, to give you an idea of the scale, these are people who were touring Chaco Canyon. These were apartment buildings where different groups of people would be living in the Chaco Valley, and they even had indoor plumbing. So again, these are not people who, as the Europeans would like to portray them later on, as being savages or uncivilized. They were very, very sophisticated in what they were able to accomplish and achieve in terms of fashioning their homes, and then also using ingenuity to create a way to farm through this irrigation. Along the Pacific coastline in California, you had hundreds of different language groups, which meant you had hundreds of different tribes around. They were great fishermen along that coastline as well. And then these totem poles are going to be unique to the Northwest, so the Pacific Northwest. So that would be kind of like Washington State, Oregon, up through Canada. You would see more of these totem poles, which tell a story of their clan and their family identity. All right, the trade patterns. So again, we're going to see that the communities, as they were able to specialize in labor, they grew different crops, had access to different types of animals. They would come together. during certain times of the year, and the various tribes would interact. And so these trade patterns are known to us because we've been able to find artifacts. If you're finding seashells in and around Cahokia, then those had to come from the coast somehow. So you've got to have interaction, and we're able to find, you know, bones and different types of drawings and paintings on the sides of pottery and things that give us an idea of these trade patterns that take place. So notice this depiction here. You've got these natives who are trading, but then you've also got some Europeans who are nearby. And so the Europeans are going to become part of this trade network and basically hire out, if you want to call it hiring out or taking advantage of, the natives to get some of these goods that they will then sell back in Europe. Religiously, the natives are going to be animist, which means that they believe that nature has this spiritual connection. And so if you've got rain, or you're going on a hunt and you were able to be successful in that hunt, then all of that is tied together with your spiritual connection to nature that has allowed you to do that. So it's about respecting and honoring nature. So it's not a it's an animistic type of religion where they're putting sacred values and qualities on natural elements. One of the ceremonies that's pretty famous for the native groups would be the green corn ceremony, and it was about this idea of the harvest and the renewal of life, and women being very honored in society because of their ability to reproduce in the community and in the societies. So again, these trade patterns and then the religious elements of animism would have been similar among the different regional groups of natives, but where they're going to be different is in how they live, how they hunt and farm, and the types of housing that they have. So those are going to be the differences, where we've got some similarities in the way that they worship and the way that they are going to trade. All right, so if we're talking again about these collision of cultures, we've talked about the indigenous culture that was here in 1491. We want to look at what was going on in Europe as well. So this is a depiction of Italy, and we're going to have these merchants who had become quite wealthy with trade in the East. It was more like the Byzantine Empire and the Arab trade in the Mediterranean that had become very, very successful. And the Italians were the ones who first tapped into that. The Western Europeans, they were just really on this fringe of civilization. It was more the Arab success in the Middle East and in the Byzantine Empire that was really beginning to take off. Western Europe was just starting to develop, starting here with the Italians. And you can see here where there is this procession at St. Mark's Square. And so you've got this connection between the wealth of the merchants, and then we've got the Catholic religion that's going to be feeding into this as well in this old world. Look at this map. So if we think about the Americas and we went back and looked at a map of the various tribal groups in the Americas, we would have had large areas, large civilizations. Think about the Aztec civilization or the Inca civilization. It was a very large expanse of land that was controlled within the kingdom of Montezuma, or in the case of the Incas, of Atahualpa. But look at Europe, especially Western Europe, how all of these little tiny principalities were developing, and all of these little groups were all rivals with one another. So there was constant fighting that was going on, and there was very little time for progress to be made. We do see that the French kingdom was beginning to become a little bit more established. We've got Aragon and Castile that are going to be unified together when Ferdinand and Isabella get married and unify this into the Spanish kingdom. We've got England that's being developed, And so all of these areas in the West are just starting to see kind of their development, where it's the Italian merchants that have all the money at the time. All right, so the kings, again, because there's so many different principalities, they're all kind of fighting with one another. And as the merchants are becoming more wealthy, they're actually competing with the monarchs for power. And then you throw in the Catholic Church. And so it's kind of like these three groups that are all competing with one another. And the monarchs end up having to make agreements or negotiations with the nobles. Think back to the Magna Carta that was signed. I believe it was King Charles that had to sign the Magna Carta. You've got the French estates that are going to be working in conjunction with the French king. You've got the church, the Catholic Church, the divine right of kings, where that's kind of this branch of the church, and all of it is kind of tied together. So this power is all going to be handed down through this patriarchal society. It's all a male-dominated society, where we saw in the Americas, it was more of a matrilineal society. The power and the influence within a family is patriarchal. And then I also want you to take note of this term, primogeniture. This was the system of dividing up the wealth and the power within a family. So let's say that I was a father and I had 5 or 6 sons, and I died, but I had 1,000 acres of land and I had some wealth. All of my wealth would go to my oldest son. I would not divide it up equally among my 5 or 6 children. Everything would go to the oldest son, who would then pass it down to his oldest son. So this is primogeniture. Primo meaning first, geniture talking about generations or so. It would be the children within the family. And the reason for this is because if we go back to this idea of all these little principalities, land is scarce. That's one of the problems that Europeans will have, is that there's not an abundance of land. So if in my family I have 1,000 acres of land, that is what makes me part of the nobility. Land is power and is wealth in Europe. So the last thing I want to do is divide it up among my 5 or 6 kids, and then they divide up their land holding among their 5 or 6 kids. And within a few generations, what happens to my family's power? It's gone. So with the idea of primogeniture, you're keeping that nobility or that land holding status intact. Now, it kind of is a problem if you're one of the younger brothers in the family. And if you were a daughter in the family, then your best hope is to marry one of the oldest sons in another family. So what we're going to end up finding, especially when we get into later European exploration or in the age of exploration, many of those explorers happen to be the younger sons in these wealthier families. Because what if they got to lose? They're relying on their older brother, giving them, a nice house to live in on the estate, because you don't really have any power or money of your own. You're relying on your older brother. So sometimes if they went on these expeditions, then if they were to strike it rich, then they didn't have to rely on the older brother. So not always, but sometimes we find that these explorers tended to be the younger sons in those European families where the older brothers had gotten everything. The peasants, who made up the vast majority of the society, are going to be at the bottom of the social pyramid, and they're going to be relying on the nobles or the landed, the lords, to allow them to live within the walls. Because again, if all these different principalities are competing with one another, war would often break out. And so for safety reasons, you would be protected by the lord of the manor, and there would be knights who are defending the area, and you would have the walls around the community, and then the peasants would work the land. So this was kind of the Middle Age system, and I know you studied this back in world history as well. But what we end up seeing is this creation of a social pyramid. So we've got the lower classes that make up the bulk of the society here. And the hierarchy continues to move up until you eventually are going to be the king, right? Who's at the top? Well, who gives the king his power? That would be the church, because again, the church has this divine right of kings, and so they're ordaining and agreeing that yes, this king is the most powerful. If you've got some sort of a skill or a craft that you're successful at, or maybe you even somehow own your own small plot of land, then you would be a little bit better off than these peasants or serfs. Then you've got the nobles that are divided into different groups. So the ones that are landed, that have the manors, they're going to be above the ones who are performing the jobs for the nobility, which would be like the knights and the police forces and that kind of thing. So you've got this social hierarchy. So this is in Europe. But I want you to think about, well, did we have similar types of stratification of power in the Americas at the same time? So if this is in the Middle Ages, right before the Renaissance, we see the same type of structure here in the Aztec society. So you've got these commoners, farmers, they enslaved one another. If they took over different territory, they might enslave those workers. You've got the people who specialize in certain areas. Maybe they're merchants, or they've got some sort of a craft that they're good at. They're going to be a little bit more on that higher order than the commoners. Then you've got these nobles who may own some land. They may have some sort of connection with more success in the merchant class or whatever it is. And then you've got the royal family who are connected to the king or the high priest. So you've got a very similar type of structure in the Aztec social pyramid that you would have found in the European. Now, here's my question. When the Europeans first arrived, would they have given the Aztecs any sort of credit for having a similar civilization to themselves? And the answer is no. They viewed the Aztecs as being less than, the sophisticated European way of life, when actually it's very, very similar. The trade networks in Western Europe do begin to expand. We talked about how it began here in Italy, and was beginning to expand these trade routes. And as the Western Europeans began to form their own successes and trying to develop their own trade, they wanted to block the Italians from taking control. So the Hanseatic League, it was where all of these little principalities that are all separate work together for trade to control and limit the power of the Italians. So it's kind of a rivalry that's going on between these different areas. And by linking up together and forming these trade networks, these trade leagues, then they were able to work together to further all of their causes and not be taken advantage of by the Italians, who were already very well established here. The rise of Christianity that is going to challenge the Catholic Church and the Crusades that are trying to prevent the spread of Islam as it was developing here in the Mideast and then moving in through North Africa. And then the Crusades were a number of religious wars that were fought with these European Christians who were trying to block the spread of Islam in the areas here. All right, so after that happens, this is kind of, again, a recap of world history. So we get into the Reformation, and this is because as the Catholic Church became more and more powerful, there was also some questions about some of the practices within the Catholic Church and whether it was appropriate. So you talked about in world history, Martin Luther and his 95 Theses, basically his 95 complaints that he had about the Catholic Church and the selling of indulgences, and whether that was really part of what should be this Christian foundation. And so they're going to demand a reform within the Catholic Church. So this Reformation is also part of our story here, as we see these rivalries begin to grow between the monarchs of some of the European nations, that some are Catholic and some become Protestant, and that furthers the conflict between them and adds to the rivalry that causes them to compete for expansion into North America. All right, so that's two of our areas when we're talking about the collision of societies. So we've got European, we've got American, and now we need to look at African society, because that's also going to play a very strong part in our network in the Atlantic world. So in Africa, you've got this northern coast of Africa that's going to be part of the trade network with Italy at the time and into Europe. And then you've got a lot of material or metal resources. You've got a lot of gold that's going to be coming out of this West African area. But to get this gold and this wealth to the coast to trade in Europe, you got to cross a desert, which is going to be very difficult to do. And there are certain civilizations that form that create these caravans that can cross through the desert and begin to trade these West African goods that become more well known to the Europeans. And so instead of just relying on the trade on this Mediterranean coast, some of the Europeans began to say, well, I want to go directly to the source and begin to gather some of those resources ourselves. All right, so the West African empires that begin to form, they are going to be successive over time. So these West African kingdoms all are going to be in about the same region. So it's below the Sahara Desert in this part of West Africa. We start with the Ghana Empire, and they're going to have this trade network, and then it expands the Mali Empire, and then eventually the Songhai Empire. And so all of these are going to be putting these caravans together that cross over the Sahara and begin to introduce really the Europeans to the goods that are coming out of West Africa. Not only gold, but they're also going to begin to sell enslaved persons from these different tribal wars. There were a couple of ways that people became enslaved within Africa. One is you might be enslaved because you can't pay your debts. You might be enslaved by your relatives because of famine or something to try to support the family, or it may be out of tribal warfare. So there were a number of different ways that people became enslaved within Africa. So these caravans that crossed over the Sahara, one of the leaders, okay, Mansa Musa, is going to, along the way, he's got this huge pilgrimage to Mecca. And as he goes to Mecca, he's got this entourage that's coming with him, and there's gold that's just being distributed all across this vast, expansive area as he's headed to Mecca on his pilgrimage. And the gold is coming out of West Africa. And so again, people are becoming very, very curious in Europe about where all of this gold is coming from. So this is the area that becomes the destination for many of the European explorers as they begin to try to access the region themselves rather than go through the merchants, the West African merchants that are crossing the Sahara. And this is known as the Bight of Benin. The Bight of Benin is right in here, and the Bight of Biafra. These are going to be really the areas when the slave trade picks up. This is going to be the coastal area where most of that is going to come out of, the Bight of Biafra and the Bight of Benin. And so enslaved persons coming from the interior from the Kingdom of the Congo will be brought into these areas, and there will be trading posts that are set up. The Europeans don't go into the interior of Africa for a number of reasons. One is disease that they're not immune to, and the exposure kills them. One is they don't know the land, and another reason is because of the warfare that's going on there. And so again, you can see these are the areas, these are the numbers of enslaved persons that ultimately left Africa from these different locations. And so this West Central Africa area, the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra, these are the earlier two, and then this one comes later on. So now we've got to put it all together. So we're colliding all of these groups together with this exploration and this idea of conquest. And it starts here with the Portuguese. And here's Prince Henry, the Navigator. And he was part of the Crusades and was familiar with all of the wealth and the riches that was coming out of the Indies and out of West Africa. And he puts together this, it's not really a naval academy, but it's something like that, where it's this organization where you've got all of these sailors that are working together to make the ships even better. And so out of Prince Henry the Navigator and the Portuguese development of new technology, this exploration that allows the ships to cross oceans more safely allows this new interaction among these different cultures. So you've got the caravel, which is the ships that are able to handle those long distances due to the lateen sail, right? So you studied the lateen sail last year, I know, in world history. And then you had the astrolabe and the compass that allows them to pinpoint their location in relation to the position of the stars. So this is all going to allow for that exploration. And it is going to give the Portuguese access to the West African coastline. And what ends up developing here is these merchants and these West African kings are going to enter into a trade with the Europeans. So the Europeans are going to be bringing in material goods and different types of foodstuffs into West Africa, and the West Africans are going to be providing the gold and the enslaved persons. So the one of the most famous of these locations, right? So this is going to be the West African slaves. The slaves are going to be brought from the interior to the coastline. And then here the slave ships will arrive. And the most famous one here is in Ghana, called Elmina, the Cape Coast Castle. And you can see the pictures of it here and the point of no return. So you're going to have hundreds of thousands of enslaved persons held here until those European ships show up, the trade is made, and they're going to be sent. So we call this a diaspora. Which is the movement of people from their ancestral homes. This is a forced diaspora. So these are the African slaves that are forced out from their location. And I want to show you, this is a clip. President Obama ended up visiting Elmina at the Cape Coast Castle. And this is the CNN did a story on his visit there, and I want you to pay attention to what he has to say, and you'll be able to see the different areas of the Cape Coast Castle.
I'm Anderson Cooper in Cape Coast, Ghana, and this is a special edition of 360, President Obama's African Journey. We're coming to you from Cape Coast Castle, one of several fortresses along the West African coast through which an estimated 10 to 40 million enslaved Africans were shipped off to the New World, many of those, of course, ending up in America. The president came here as part of a presidential trip, his first presidential trip to sub-Saharan Africa, but it's also a trip that is in many ways deeply personal for President Obama. It's a journey that encompasses both the politics of today and the still painful memories of our past. As you walk around this castle, what goes through your mind?
Well, obviously, it's a powerful moment for not just myself, but I think for Michelle and the girls. I'm reminded of the same feeling I got when I went to Buchenwald with Elie Wiesel. You almost feel as if the walls can speak, and that you try to project yourself into these incredibly harrowing moments that people go through.
How'd you explain it to Sasha Malia?
Well, you try to explain that people were willing to degrade others because they appeared differently, and you tried to actually get them to engage in the imaginative act of what it would be like if they were snatched away from mom and dad and sent to someplace they had never seen before. But part of what you also try to do with kids is to get them to imagine themselves on the other side as being the slave merchant, and that slave merchant might have loved their children and gone to that place of worship up right above the dungeon, and get them to make sure that they're constantly asking themselves questions about whether they're treating people fairly and whether they are examining their own behavior and how it affects others.
That's something you referenced actually during the campaign in your speech on race about your own wife, about Mrs. Obama. You said that she has the blood of slaves and also slave owners.
Right.
How did she respond to being here?
I haven't had a chance to process it yet. I think we were both listening and talking to the children. But I can't imagine that for her mother who's with us, our children's godmother who's with us, all of whom are direct descendants of slaves, that seeing that portal doesn't send a powerful message. The kinds of emotions that must be evoked. On the one hand, it's through this door that the journey of the African American experience begins, and Michelle and her family, like me, draw incredible inspiration and strength from that African American journey.
What must have been the most emotional part of his trip took place here at Cape Coast Castle. This is where enslaved Africans were held before being shipped to the New World, being shipped to America. They were kidnapped from their homes, taken from their villages, ripped from their families. And as soon as they were brought here, the men were separated from the women. Door of no return, through which hundreds of thousands of slaves were sent.
And on the other end, obviously, there's a sense of what a profound sorrow must have been felt as people were hauled off into the great unknown.
Do you think what happened here still has resonance in America? That the slave experience still is something that should be talked about and should be remembered and should be present in everyday life?
Well, I think that the experience of slavery is like the experience of the Holocaust. I think it's one of those things you don't forget about. I think it's important that the way we think about it and the way it's taught is not one in which there's simply a victim and a victimizer, and that's the end of the story. I think the way it has to be thought about, the reason it's relevant is because whether it's what's happening in Darfur or what's happening in the Congo or what's happening in too many places around the world, the capacity for cruelty still exists. The capacity for discrimination still exists. The capacity to think about people who are different, not just on the basis of race, but on the basis of religion or the basis of sexual orientation or gender still exists. And so, trying to use these kinds of extraordinary moments to widen the lens and make sure that we're all reflecting on how we're treating each other, I think is something that I want my kids to think about, and I want every child to think about.
They say this is the door of return for African Americans who are revisiting Ghana. And I talked to one African American lady yesterday who said that coming here is such a powerful experience that she actually decided to move here. I know you've met with many African Americans who decided to move here. Do you understand? They say that there's a sense of coming home. Do you understand that feeling?
Well, I will tell you, the first time that I traveled to Africa, I think that there is a special sense for African Americans of somehow connecting up with a part of yourself that you might not have even been aware was there. Now, obviously, for me, it was different because I was directly meeting relatives and learning about a father I didn't know. But I do think there's a sense for a lot of African Americans that it's a profound, life-changing experience. The interesting thing, though, is I've met a lot of white Americans who come to Africa and say it was a life-changing experience for them too.
This is the home where everyone comes from.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a powerful sense of tapping into something very elemental about
Sure, once
Africa.
you come, you sort of always come back.
Yeah, you do. So, but I do think that the spirit, particularly of a place like Ghana, where for all the difficulties it's still going through, the people are just incredibly open and friendly and welcoming. I think that makes a difference for a lot of people who, maybe African Americans who feel somehow that they never fully belong. And the only thing I would say, though, is there's a flip side to this, which is I know an awful lot of African Americans who come to Africa, are profoundly moved, but also realize how American they are when they're here, and recognize that they could never live here. And that's part of the African American experience. You are, in some ways, connected to this distant land, but on the other end, you're about as American as it gets. In some ways, African Americans are more fundamentally rooted in the American experience because they don't have a recent immigrant experience to draw on. It's that unique African American culture that has existed in North America for hundreds of years.
All right, so again, I think that is just an incredible video, and what President Obama is talking about is critical. When we begin looking at United States history and we begin to talk about the slavery part of that, you can't talk about slavery in the United States without first talking about Africa and the roots of the slave trade system and where this all began. And it starts here with Elmina and other areas along that Bight of Benin and along that coast of West Africa. So we will certainly revisit this many, many more times as we move forward in our story. So Spanish exploration, they arrive, as we've talked about before, in North America. We've got the exploration here with Christopher Columbus first arriving. He had gotten that permission from Ferdinand and Isabella to fund his expedition. He was actually from Genoa. He was actually an Italian sailor who is going to get the Spanish on board with exploring in what he believes is this western route to Asia to get Spain kind of cranked up into that merchant trade that the Italians had already been part of. Well, when Columbus lands in what Hispaniola, which is actually a little bit south of Cuba in what today would be the Bahamas or the Dominican Republic in that area, he actually has a number of expeditions. The first one lands in the Bahamas, then he ends up on the Dominican Republic. And when he's there, he doesn't realize that he's not in Asia. They didn't know that there was this whole continent in between. So Columbus and the exploration there then gives rise to Cortez showing up and Pizarro, as we've mentioned. So you've got Pizarro that's going to be here in the Incan Empire, and then Cortez taking control of the Aztec Empire and the Mayan Empire along the Yucatan Peninsula. And so all of those expeditions come from the area that Columbus has established in his early voyages. We will be reading about the ideas of the explorers and the conquistadors. Later on, we're going to be looking at two different perspectives on how this should all be handled with the natives. One of the other parts of this, as Portugal gets involved, Portugal is going to establish this network of African slaves coming out of West Africa to work on their sugar plantations. So as Henry the Navigator and the sailing is being worked on, the ships go farther away from the coastlines, right? It's safer to sail along that coastline. The waters aren't as deep or as choppy. But as the sailing technology gets better, they move farther from the coastline, and that's when they end up establishing these sugar plantations in Brazil. So today, one of the language in Brazil is Portuguese, and that's because of that Portuguese foundation here with this early exploration and establishment of the colony, the sugar plantations that are there. Very, very labor intensive. And large numbers of enslaved persons from Africa will go to the Brazil sugar plantations. All right, this first little part of chapter 2 fits in with the unit, the College Board unit. So I'm only going to touch on this first little part with the Spanish settlement in North America. So there are three types of colonies that the Europeans will establish in North America. One will be the tribute colonies that we will look at here in the Caribbean. Then the next type of colonies will be these plantation colonies. And then the last one would be the Neo-European colonies, where they're trying to basically create little Europes. So these tribute colonies will be where they rely on the indigenous people for the labor. So what they're extracting out of the colony is being extracted from the natives themselves, all right? So it's the resources that are already there. It will be the labor of the people who are already there, who will take that for the home country, in this case, Spain. So you can see that all of these areas in yellow are Spanish tribute colonies. So they really dominate. So here's Florida, Spanish Florida. You've got Cuba. All of this in what becomes Mexico, Central and South America is all going to be, and the islands of the Caribbean, taken over by the Spanish. So this is all under the direct control of the Spanish king. And the Spanish king will set up viceroyalties, which would be almost like dividing up the areas. So this lighter yellow would be the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So it's kind of one division that's under the Viceroy, one person who's in charge of overseeing all of these colonial operations. And then the Viceroyalty of Peru, in this darker yellow that goes down through South America, would be under the control of someone else who is given power by the Spanish king. All right, one of the incentives that conquistadors had for going into North America and working to control these areas is what was known as an encomienda. And I would certainly highlight the term encomienda, because this is what the Spanish could get. If you distinguished yourself as a good warrior, as someone who is working hard for the king or the viceroy, then you would be rewarded for your efforts by being given what's called an encomienda. All right, so look at the plan here. So the Spanish are going to come in as settlers, one for the tribute that they're going to be getting out of Spain, which would be the wealth, but also to spread Catholicism. So the efforts here, if you're distinguishing yourself and you are given an encomienda, then you are given a plot of land and you are given the rights to the native labor on that land. And then you're going to be given a portion of what comes out of that. All right. Now, the bulk of the value of it, so the gold, the huge silver deposits that come out of well, probably the largest would be the Potosi mines that are going to be producing a lot of silver. So a lot of silver, a lot of gold coming out of here. These Spanish conquistadors are going to be rewarded for their efforts by being given this land. All right, so that's the plan. What ends up happening is that the Indians are going to be subjugated here, right? So the Spanish are supposed to protect and care for and provide these Indians with this, new way of life. Well, in reality, they're just going to be subjugated labor for the Spanish. And then they also end up dying of disease because of the working conditions. Large numbers of Africans will be brought in after the Indian population dies off in large numbers. So these abuses by the encomienda system are going to lead to a couple of revolts. You're going to have some of the religious leaders that are going to say, whoa, wait a minute, this is not what we mean by Christianizing the Indians. So there's going to be a little bit of conflict within Spain over how this is being handled. And there's also going to be a lot of conflict among the native groups as well, trying to protect their way of life. But bottom line, this encomienda is the incentive that the conquistadors will have. Over time, as hundreds of thousands of Spaniards arrive in North America, there's going to be a pretty elaborate social structure that forms, and a lot of it has to do with ethnicity. So you've got Europeans, you have indigenous natives, and you have Africans all in one area. And the vast majority of the Europeans who come are male. And so there are going to be different groups of people that will end up being in a hierarchy. And so and it's tied to this legal rights and the opportunities that people have, which would be known as the casta system. So this is a name for the social hierarchy that's based on race and ethnicity. So notice what we see here. Down at the bottom, so we've got the least power at the bottom, but the broader part of the triangle, meaning that there's more people that fit into this category. So we've got the native peoples who are native Indians, as Columbus called them, and people of African descent who were brought to the Americas to work to replace those natives who died off. Then above that, you would see the mestizos and the mulattoes. So these are going to be people of mixed race. So if you had a European conquistador or someone who'd been given an encomienda who is going to have children, or if you're someone who your father is European and your mother is African, then you would be called mulatto. If you were a person whose father was European and your mother was native, then you would be a mestizo. All right. Then we've got people who are Creoles. These are people who are European, but they're born in the colonies. So they're above these people who are mixed race, but they are below people who are directly from Europe, right? So these peninsulars, if you were from the European to Spanish peninsula in Europe, you are of the highest class, you have the most power. If you are a second generation, right, someone of European descent, but not actually from Europe, you're next, and then you've got the mixed race. And so all of this goes along with legal rights as well. So in order to, and then you've also got Zambos. These would be people who would be of Native and African descent, both. And so all of this is going to become very complex in the social structure. So these pictures are representing the different combinations of people of different relationships and how they have different legal rights and social rights in New Spain. Columbian Exchange, this is also one of the big items that College Board is definitely wanting you to be very, very familiar with, which is the exchange of items and diseases that are going to cross both ways. So you have, look at this list of items. So we've got certain diseases that are going to be brought with the Europeans as they are going to establish colonies here in the New World. They're also going to be bringing a lot of new foodstuffs, the wheat, right? The grains, wheat and rice would be new, sugar, also new beasts of burden, horses, pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, all of that's going to be brought with Europeans to the Americas. Look what comes back to Europe. So we've got corn, potatoes, beans, squash. So those three sisters that we've talked about, think about the transformation of the ability to sustain larger populations in Europe. Land is a very, very scarce commodity in Europe. But if you can have a high yield crop, right? Corn is a high yield crop. You can produce a lot of corn that can sustain a lot of people in a small area of land. So all of these are going to be high yield crops that are going to be very, very important for European success and improvement later on. One of the diseases that this isn't listed here, but syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease that the natives gave to the conquistadors who took it back to Europe. So that was one disease that went back the other direction. So again, remember that this Columbian Exchange, this is all one big network of movement of goods between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. We will also get into more specifics of triangular trade, where you bring in the African element of this in Unit 2. So stay tuned for that. All right, so this is where the English are going to start to get involved. And it goes back to Henry VIII. And you may remember this story from world history where Henry VIII is, he's Catholic. And when he's the one that ends up with 8 wives, and he blames them for not giving him a son, a male heir. And his wife, Catherine of Aragon, she is the Spanish princess. So King Philip of Spain was Catherine's father. And so they're all Catholic here. And when Catherine doesn't provide Henry VIII with a son, he wants to divorce her. And the Pope refuses to give the divorce, grant the divorce. And so he says, fine, I'm no longer Catholic. I'm going to create my own religion. We're going to call it the Church of England, of which, by the way, I am the head of the church, right? Henry VIII, the king, makes himself the head of this church. And guess what? He is going to be granted his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. So this creates a strong rivalry between Spain and England that starts here with this conflict with Henry VIII and the Catholic Church and Catherine of Aragon of Spain. So all of it's kind of tied together. So he makes the Pope angry, he makes Spain angry. The Protestants think, oh, this is pretty good, because remember that Reformation, this idea of reforming the Catholic Church and its problems. When he creates the Church of England, the Protestants think, perfect, this is exactly what we want. But when you look at the Church of England, it's really very similar to the Catholic Church. The same rituals, you're going to have the same sort of hierarchy within the church. Other than having a pope, you're going to have the king as the head of the Church of England. You're going to still have bishops. You're still going to have the same. If you went to a service at the Church of England, the liturgy, the things that you would say, the songs that you would sing, all of the process would be very, very similar to the Catholic Church. So not all the Protestants were on board once they really got into the approach of the Church of England. All right, so Henry VIII dies eventually. His daughter, Elizabeth I, ends up becoming queen, and she is Protestant, and she is going to challenge Spain's wealth, right? So Spain has developed all of this gold and silver that they've extracted from their tribute colonies, and she's got this rivalry with Spain, and so she is going to develop her own group of sailors and these ships, sophisticated ships that are going to go and try to slow down this Spanish expansion. So Francis Drake is going to be one of those sailors that will be part of, they called themselves the Sea Dogs, these sailors who were going out in the name of England and Queen Elizabeth to go and develop success and power of their own. And they end up getting into this big fight with the Spanish in the shipping, and they're going to end up, Francis Drake ends up capturing a couple of the Spanish treasure ships, and they claim the treasure for themselves, and they bring the gold and silver back to England, which of course makes the King of Spain very, very angry. So he launches his own armada that goes after the Spanish ships, and there's this big fight. So remember, if we go all the way back to the beginning, and we were talking about John White, the artist who had made those drawings of the Roanoke colony and how he had left to come back to England to get supplies, but he got derailed and didn't make it back to Virginia for like 3 years. Well, it's because this whole fight between the English and the Spanish was occupying everything that was going on in Europe. And so that's how he was stuck and not able to get back to Roanoke as quickly. All right, so this is all going on here, and England is now on the rise. Now, Spain, in an effort to try to hang on to all of its power, is spending money and more money, and they've got all of these fancy cathedrals for the Catholic Church, and they're gold plated, and all of this just really elaborate display of their wealth. Well, Spain burns through its money. So Spain is now starting to decline, and England is starting to develop its power. And Elizabeth is really kind of the root of that, is where that idea of expansion for England begins. The key for England, and really for all colonies or all imperial powers, is this idea of mercantilism. And I would definitely highlight this term. What you want to do if you are a country who has a desire for wealth and power is you need to export more goods than you import. And the way that you're going to be able to do that is to make sure that you can provide all of your own raw materials, and you're going to get those raw materials from colonies. All right, so look at this diagram. So here's the mother country. Let's pretend that this is England. England is going to have a colony, maybe Virginia, and England is going to have a colony, maybe somewhere in the Caribbean, okay? All of the materials, raw materials, are going to come out of the colony to England. All of the material good, or the resources coming out of the colony, go to England. England is now beginning to sponsor manufacturing. So when we talk about state-sponsored manufacturing, the government of England is providing incentives for manufacturing. They are providing a way for those goods to be produced using new technology. Okay, and the government of England is helping to make that happen. Maybe giving tax incentives or providing land or whatever it is to a company to make that happen. Once they have their finished products, all of these people who are living in the colony are buying the finished products back from England. These colonies are not allowed to trade with one another. So it's not about making the colony profitable. Mercantilism means that the colony exists solely to make the mother country profitable. So we're not worried about these colonies growing and becoming powerful in their own right. We want to keep them under control so that they are continuing to provide goods for England. All right, another way of looking at this is to think about gold and silver as being your profit. The way you're going to be given that gold and silver or gaining more of it is by not having to spend as much of it for raw materials. So if you're in England, which is a little island in the North Atlantic, and you don't grow your own raw material, whatever it is, right? There's not a whole lot of forested area there. So if you're building ships, you've got to have lumber from somewhere. Well, you've got to buy it because you don't really have enough forested land of your own. Well, that's going to cost money. Well, instead, if you can get a colony that provides you with all that timber, then you save money from your treasury. All right, so think about this as a balance. You want fewer imports, right? You're not having to buy from the outside those raw materials, and you want more exports. So the more exports you have, this is a better balance of trade. This is more money for you, okay? So again, colonies are providing the raw materials. The mother country is manufacturing those items into a finished product of some sort, and then you're selling it right back to the colonies. So all of this is about making money. All right, so we will get further into mercantilism. Let me stop sharing and come back. So this has been a good look at the colonies and this idea of the North American society prior to the Europeans arriving and the Spanish tribute colonies. What we will be getting into in Unit 2 is going to be the English colonies and the Dutch colonies and the French, who are going to establish a different type of colony. So I hope that's helped. And as always, I'm here to answer any questions that you may have. And I will see you next time. Bye.